in almost every respect. When you compare Younger Than Yesterday to Fifth Dimension, at least the best songs in Fifth Dimension, it's not such a big stylistic departure or a difference in quality. It's just kind of continuing what they were doing at a very high level.
There was a confidence about it, though, that there was a kind of ease to it. You know, something that I think maybe is even reflected in the title. I think the Byrds had, for whatever they were also going through as a band, had proven themselves to themselves. You know, so that if you have a country song next to a kind of space rock song, next to, you know, a dreamy psychedelic song, next to, you know, almost, you know, a Dylan cover, you know, that was the terrain that they'd mapped out. And, you know, they were exploring it, I think, with a lot of flair.
They're using backwards tapes for the first time and various effects. You know, there's phasing, there's McGuinn doing space rock on CTA 102 with an array of effects. And there's David Crosby producing magnificent songs like Renaissance Fair and Everybody's Been Burned.
Everybody has been burned before. Everybody knows the pain.
I think Crosby was a songwriter of genius in a way that I don't think I'd use that word about Hillman, Clark or McGuinn, but it was a wayward genius. It was a very left field genius. I mean, he wrote songs like nobody else. He seemed to use chords that nobody else had ever heard.
Everybody's Been Burned is one of those songs that you can listen to now, and it sounds like it was written yesterday. There's a kind of timeless quality that it has, and you know, it's very sort of haunted and strange that Crosby could really get at in his music, and clearly it announced that you know, that he was going to be a force as a songwriter.
I know all too well how to turn, how to run, how to hide behind a bitter wall of blue.
It's actually an underrated album because arguably I think it's the best of those first four albums as a cohesive album, and yet you see it comes out in 1967 at the same time as albums like Sgt. Pepper, Jefferson Airplane's Surrealistic Pillow, the first Doors album, Jimi Hendrix, Are You Experienced? I mean, this is a pivotal moment in the history of rock music where everything is changing. And I think it actually suffered in comparison because of the time that it came out. But looking back 40 years on, you know, it's a fine album that when we talk about 67 and the first Summer of Love, you know, that album should be up there as one of the key artifacts.
You know, they're shooting this for television. I'm sure that they'll edit this out. I want to say it anyway, even though they will edit it out. When President Kennedy was killed, he was not killed by one man. He was shot from a number of different directions by different guns. The story has been suppressed. Witnesses have been killed. And this is your country, ladies and gentlemen.
While the spirit of the counterculture reached its apex during 1967's Summer of Love, new tensions were straining relationships within the Byrds. David Crosby had begun to flaunt his new prominence as lead vocalist and songwriter. His on-stage grandstanding and flirtation with rival groups like the Buffalo Springfield irked the other band members. McGuinn and Hillman unceremoniously fired Crosby from the Byrds.
I was certainly outrageous. I probably helped tilt it towards outrageousness.
I mean, David Crosby was, and I've interviewed him many times, and he's admitted this on numerous occasions. You know, he was a very difficult human being to be in a band with at that time. He was self-opinionated. He could be quite obnoxious. Perhaps the only surprise is that it took McGuinn and Hillman as long as it did to fire him. On the other hand, I think the Byrds lost something when he went. They lost their maverick spirit. Crosby was the one, if you like, who could fly higher than any of the others, in every sense.
The material that they made became less pop, less rock oriented, became much more roots oriented, more country oriented. And it's no coincidence, I think, that commercially they slid down further right after Crosby left and never got back to the same level they had been in 1967.
With Crosby's departure, Gene Clark returned to the Byrds, though his tenure would only last 3 weeks. A further rupture occurred when Michael Clark became the third Byrds casualty, and Chris Hillman's cousin, Kevin Kelly, took over on drums. Incredibly, throughout all this upheaval, the band continued to record sessions for a new album, the notorious Byrd Brothers.
Terrible state of affairs. I mean, firing David Crosby, it's just an incredible thing to do. And then Clark returning and then leaving in a matter of weeks. How could it not be that the game was up? And yet they struggled through with an album and produced a fantastic album with depleted forces. They produced one of the greatest albums of all time, in my view.
When you listen to the notorious Byrd Brothers, it combines all of the elements the Byrds had been investigating in their previous albums, and combines more of them and combines them more coherently than any of those other albums did. You have folk and rock, of course, but you have pop in the Goff and King material that's covered. You have electronics in some of the sound effects being used. You have country rock becoming stronger in Old John Robertson. And you have the vocal arrangements being just as good and full as they were on any Byrds record.
Notorious Byrd Brothers could almost be described as a concept album were it not for the fact that there actually wasn't a concept to work with. It had a thematic unity, I suppose, and that was partly due to cross-references of songs about nature and change. But it also, all the songs ran together as they had done on Sgt. Pepper's. There wasn't any gaps between the tracks. And it was a classic studio album. This was not an album, although the Byrds did attempt to play several songs in concert. It was not an album that you could imagine the Byrds, going out there and playing live with a great deal of comfort. The number of effects used on the album was astonishing.
I'd rather go and journey where the diamond crescent's glowing and run across the valley beneath the sacred mountain and wander through the forest where the trees have leaves of prisms and break the light in colors that no one knows the names of.
It's a great, great album, and Crosby's influence, although he's out of the band by then, is still enormous. He's got two of the best songs on the album. Wasn't Born to Follow, with that marvellous use of phasing, which has barely been bettered since.
Wasn't Born to Follow. I think that's a really good example of how the Byrds were exceptional cover artists. Everybody knows about the Bob Dylan songs, and to some degree the Pete Seeger songs. They tend to forget that they also covered songs by less likely writers like Jerry Goffin and Carole King, who had come out of the Brill Building tradition. And here they're taking a song like that and making it into a folk rock psychedelic song. You would never suspect that it's been written by these professional tunesmiths. And of course, when it was used in the film Easy Rider, it seemed like a reflection of the very free spirit that the counterculture itself was feeling at that time.
Although it's this Tin Pan Alley pop song, Wasn't Born to Follow. It could be a motto for the counterculture.
I will want to dive beneath the white cascading waters. She may beg, she may plead, she may argue with her logic and mention all the things I lose that really have no value In the end, she will surely know I wasn't born to follow.
Released in January '68, the notorious Byrd brothers also displayed a sharper political edge than much of the Byrds' previous work, an edge particular to the songwriting of their wayward former companion.
Draft Morning, I don't think McGuinn was very keen to record it. You know, I mean, this was the great thing about Crosby. He wrote about these difficult subjects. You know, he wrote about having a ménage à trois with two girls. He wrote about the Vietnam War.
He'd written the song for the album, but he was fired and they decided to do it anyway. And according to Hillman, they couldn't really remember most of the lyrics, or they could only remember part of the lyrics, so they added a few themselves to his one, and it became a kind of strange hybrid. And Crosby was very upset about that, although he kept quiet about it at the time. But I remember meeting him later and never seen him so angry. You know, they stole it. Yeah? They took that song and they put it on the record without even asking me. That's theft! And that was Crosby on Draft Morning.
I think Notorious Byrd Brothers and Younger Than Yesterday do reflect a kind of particularly strong period of the Byrds. There was a kind of sense of they're exploring all the full range of interests that the band had with a lot of confidence. So that if you wanted to kind of take a snapshot where you could go back to see where the band came from, and you can look ahead to see where the band would be going. Those two records, I think, represent a definition of the terrain that the Byrds would occupy.
The Notorious Byrd brothers represented the final statement from the first incarnation of the Byrds. With the band reduced to only two of its original members and buffeted by changing musical and cultural winds, the path ahead was far from clear.